Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third session of MERI Forum. I am Athanasios Manis, Senior Research Fellow at MERI. The session's title is Winning the War Against ISIS, Visions and Strategies. This title might sound to many of you extremely optimistic or non-realistic even under the current circumstances. But what this title states is what should be the telos or the ultimate objective for the international community and the Iraqi components of the federal government, including Kurdistan, in terms of their policies vis-à-vis ISIS, namely to address comprehensively this problem that has brought Iraq to its knees. However, this is not as easy as it might sound. Regardless of the strong will of the international community and local actors to engage militarily with ISIS, without the intention of legitimizing its existence and cause, I think that it is important to state that this phenomenon is mainly a symptom of many weaknesses that coexist in Iraq. To name but a few, sectarianism, a dysfunctional federal state, lack of democratization, and lack of good governance have created a favorable environment for ISIS to emerge and become stronger. I have the pleasure to present an excellent panel that consists of decision makers as well as experts that together can describe different aspects of these winning visions and strategies. First of all, on my right, I have His Excellency Mr. Qubat Talabani, the Deputy Prime Minister of the KRG. Then we have Mr. Shervan Al-Wali, Security Advisor to the President of Iraq. His Excellency Mr. Stuart Jones, Ambassador of the US to Iraq, and Mr. David Pollock. The panel, among other issues, can discuss what ISIS is and what winning against ISIS will look like given the current context, and addressing challenges and prospects for ending the conflict in the short and medium term. Political, economic, social, and diplomatic aspects can be brought in. In addition, the panelists can touch upon the effectiveness of international coalition airstrikes, the train and equip effort for the Iraqi army, and the role of Hashishtabi, Shia militias, and the Peshmerga in efforts to degrade and destroy ISIS. Thank you very much. I hope you find the discussion interesting. I would like to remind to our panelists that you have 15 minutes to give your presentation, and then a Q&A will follow. Please.
Thank you for inviting me to this event. I want to take this moment to express my appreciation to everybody at the MERI Forum for this event, for putting us all together, and for creating a forum for us to be able to discuss issues of strategic significance to Iraq and the region. I also want to take this opportunity to express my condolences to the family and friends of Dr. Ahmed Chalabi, a great Iraqi leader that the country has lost, and we will feel his loss, I think, for many, many years to come. Behani Tanbash, Kushkubrani Barez, Ahmad Abwani Barez, Spasi, Dr. Dilawarakam, و همو هاوکارانی لدیداری MERI بۆ بانگێشتکردنم بۆ ئەم دیدارە بۆ ئەوەی لە نزیکەوە گفتوگۆی بابەتە گرنگەکان بکەین. داوام لێکراوە بە ئینگلیزی قسەتان لەگەڵا بکەم، بەڵام ئەگەر پرسیارەکانتان بە کوردی بوو من هەوڵێم بە کوردی وەڵامتان بدەمەوە. بۆیە زۆر زۆر سپاس. This panel has a very ambitious title, Winning the War Against Daesh. It's a title that there is no other scenario that we must even think of. This is not something that should even be up for discussion, but it certainly should be up for analysis, and we must certainly think about what does that actually mean. But before we can start thinking about a strategy or the plan or the vision to defeat ISIS, I would like to ask everybody to take just a few steps backwards. And first we have to define who is ISIS. Once we can define who ISIS is, then we have to look at where is ISIS. And then when we look at where ISIS is, then we can start to think about the tactics and the policies and the strategies required to defeat ISIS. First of all, I would like to, state my opinion. Many times we hear about ISIS being some sort of foreign group that's come into Iraq and has taken over a piece of territory in the country and is, we can just kick ISIS out of Iraq. I would like to state very clearly, I do not see ISIS as a foreign group. It is not a foreign force. It may have come into Iraq from another country, from Syria, but ultimately, if we look back at the various iterations before ISIS, there was the Islamic State of Iraq, is one of the predecessors of ISIL, or the Islamic State. The fact that ISIS today has pretty significant support from significant parts of the country is also a further indication that this is not just a group of foreign fighters that we can somehow kick out. And this is also, I think, relevant to the fact that ISIS did not fill a security vacuum in this country. ISIS did not come about because there wasn't enough armed forces in the country. ISIS filled a political vacuum in the country. And ISIS emerged as the force that it is today because of a failure of the politics in Iraq. And the failure of this politics can go back to several years. We all remember the surge in 2007 when the US administration upped its troop presence in the country, worked with local tribes to kick out Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the various different groups that were associated with it. Many promises were given to Iraqi citizens by the then government of Iraq, by the international community, promises that were not fulfilled today, promises that have left a bad taste in many people's mouths, promises that will make getting local support to turn against ISIS this time around even more difficult. When demonstrations first started to occur in Anbar a few years ago, ISIS was not in the picture, it was not behind these demonstrations, the calls were not what we're hearing today. These were requests for basic services, these were requests for better governance, these are requests for better participation at a federal level and greater decentralization at a local and regional level. And that didn't come about. And people in Mosul, in parts of Salah ad-Din, in Anbar, I think were left exacerbated by the failure of politics. And ultimately ISIS, Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State, whatever Daesh, as I think it's more universally known, have benefited from that sense of frustration, from that sense of the fact that these areas have been by and large neglected and ignored politically, economically, and also infrastructure-wise. So you fast forward a few years later and we have the situation where we have right now. A big portion of the country is not under the control of the federal government. You have an extreme group that is carrying out extreme tactics, that is terrorizing citizens and governments. So the first step to any strategy to defeating ISIS or defeating Daesh has to be revisiting the political strategy. One of the reasons why the surge, in my opinion, did not succeed in 2007 was because there was three key elements to the surge: clear, hold, and build. And this was all designed to create space for politics to grow, And the politics never grew. The military side of it was fine. They pounded the extremists then, they turned against them, we armed local forces. But the military track was so far ahead of the political track, was so far ahead of the economic track, that ultimately the surge failed. And I hope that we do not make that mistake again this time around. And while a lot of focus has been made on coalition strikes, and they are needed and we are grateful for them, while much has been made of the support that the coalition forces are providing to the Iraqi government, to the Kurdistan regional government, we're grateful for that. While much has been made of the support to building up local tribal capacity to fight against ISIS, this is all fantastic and necessary. But I do not see movement on the political track. I do not see movement on fixing the politics in Iraq that could go side by side with the security strategy and the military strategy. And when we look at the military strategy, I think we have to look at Iraq and Syria as one theater of operations. We cannot separate Iraq from Syria right now, because they're not separated. There is no border between Iraq and Syria today. Daesh can come and go between Syria and Iraq, and can supply its forces in Iraq from Syria, can supply its forces in Syria by its forces from Iraq. So the first thing that really we have to, again, parallel to the political track, is to recreate a boundary between Iraq and Syria. Only then can we deal with these two areas separately from a military standpoint. And that I will leave to the military experts and the military planners on the coalition side and on the Kurdish side. But having one military strategy that straddles two countries with two very different political dynamics is obviously very complicated and very difficult to manage. So it is not going to be easy to defeat Daesh. And again, I wish it was just as easy as targeting some military strikes against some key leaders in Daesh and the group would wither away and dissipate. But we cannot be unrealistic. We have to understand the gravity of the challenge that we face, the challenge that the world faces, and it's not just a challenge that we in Iraq or Kurdistan face alone. And we are warmed by the international response to ISIS. We are grateful for the support that we're receiving, but I do fear that the focus is much greater on the military campaign than it is on the political campaign. And so long as there is that imbalance between the political track and the military track, we will not defeat Daesh. We will not address the root causes of why people today are supporting a group that is beheading children. I'm certain that there is no widespread ideological sympathy or support for this group. People support this group because they fear this group, or because they feel that they are the only group that may be supporting their interests or protecting them against another group or another country. So that requires a political vision on the part of, first of all, the federal government of Iraq. There has to be a better policy. There has to be a shift in policy on how to deal with, how to treat different parts of the country, including Kurdistan. This also requires I think a shift in psychology, the country of Iraq. It requires greater support from our neighbors, and we know that's not always easy to come by. But ultimately, it requires a comprehensive strategy that is both political, military, and we mustn't ignore the economic situation. Neither Iraq nor Kurdistan is in a sound economic situation right now. It's actually both the entire country and Kurdistan is facing the biggest economic challenge I would say that we have faced, that we have ever faced. Even I would say during the extreme days of poverty in the early 90s, people were living within their means, and the government and the resources available matched the expenditure bill. But today, Iraq is facing an economic crisis like it has never faced before. Kurdistan is facing an economic crisis like it's never faced before. And it's never easy to win a war when your coffers are empty. Wars cost money. Wars cost resources. Wars cost, you need ammunition. We cannot just continue to rely on the support of our coalition partners to sustain this war. So parallel to the political track, parallel to the military strategy, has to be significant, visible, and impactful economic reforms in the country. And we were watching anxiously to see the economic reform agenda issued by Prime Minister Al-Abadi. I personally was disappointed that the Iraqi parliament has restricted or tried to rescind some of the initiatives of the Prime Minister. I think that this is a time for the Parliament and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet in Iraq, but also in the KRG, to work in unison to tackle the economic challenges facing the country. They are huge. They mustn't be ignored. We cannot ignore the humanitarian situation in the country. We have just here in Kurdistan over 1.5 million IDPs and refugees that have sought refuge here. There is displaced people all over Iraq. There's displaced people throughout the region as a result of this conflict. Repatriating, protecting, providing services to these people also costs money, costs resources, needs capabilities and expertise. So again, for the last time, I will say this requires a holistic approach. That is political, military, economic, and again, straddling many, many countries. And I'm confident that we can address these issues. I'm confident that if we have a clarity of vision, that we will address these issues. I'm confident that if we can tighten the coordination with our coalition partners to look at things in a more broader perspective, that we can overcome these challenges. We have to think about the day after Daesh. We have to think of a lot of focus is on Mosul, the liberation of Mosul. Mosul must be liberated. But militarily, I don't see a problem in liberating Mosul. But who's going to govern Mosul the day after? How are you going to keep Mosul the day after? How are you going to undo the economic damage done to Mosul the day after? These are all questions that we have to have the answers for before we send troops in to liberate Mosul. I'm sure the same applies for Raqqa. I'm sure the same applies for other parts of Iraq and Syria that are today in the hands of Daesh. And that's why I think we need to look at this more strategically and holistically. And thank you for this opportunity again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, His Excellency, Mr. Kubat Al-Abani. This was a very analytically rich and insightful presentation. I think it's very important for the public to hear their decision makers to talk analytically so that they can understand many times what are the policy choices about and how politicians come to make certain choices. So I think it is very important. Thank you very much for that. So I would like now to proceed with our next speaker. You have 15 minutes, please. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم جميعا. في ودي أن أقدم الشكر الجزيل لميري وللصديق العزيز بشكل خاص دكتور دلاور على هذا التجمع الذي يجمع صناع القرار والخبراء لحل المشكلة العراقية. وأكيد هذا التجمع وهذا المؤتمر خسر حضور الأخ والصديق وصاحب الموقف الذي لا ينكره أحد، أخينا الدكتور أحمد التشلبي، وكان المفروض أن يكون حاضرا حسب علمي في هذا المؤتمر، ولكن هو الموت، إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. بالتأكيد عندما نتكلم عن الحرب على داعش أو كسب الحرب على داعش، علينا كمشكلة داعش ومشكلة بشكل أعم هو أن نشخص الأسباب وما هي النتائج التي ترتبت على هذه الأسباب، ثم نضع الحلول، والحلول في كل المراحل، شورت تيرم، ميد تيرم، لونج تيرم، لأنه داعش اليوم مع الأسف فرضت نفسها كواقع حال في الأرض العراقية وفي كل المنطقة. وداعش بدأت تتكلم ليس كواقع عسكري وإنما واقع سياسي، وتتكلم عن دولة عابرة للحدود وعابرة للبلدان وذات بعد سياسي، بعد بأيديولوجية إرهابية، طبعا بأيديولوجية القتل والإرهاب، ولكن بامتدادات. طبعا المشكلة السياسية ابتداء هي أم المشاكل. المشاكل السياسية المحلية سواء كانت في المحافظات أو المشكلة السياسية بين المحافظات والمركز كانت أحد الأسباب في أن تكون البيئة رخوة لداعش وفصائل الإرهاب الأخرى، لأنه الخريطة السياسية اللي ارتسمت في المحافظات لا تؤدي إلى مخرجات منتجة، وإنما مخرجات نزاعات وخصومات. وبالتالي عندما يحدث خلل في الإدارة أو خلل في السياسة أكيد سيترك ثغرة إلى داعش وأمثالها أن تدخل إلى هذه الأرض العراقية. طبعا محافظاتنا فيها تنوع طائفي، إثني، قومي، وبالتالي استغلت هذه الخلافات اللي يفترض أن تكون إيجابية، باعتبار التنوع هو ظاهرة إيجابية للشعوب، ولكن أيضا استغلت سياسيا وأربكت الوضع، وبالتالي مهدت للذي حدث. المنظومة الأمنية بنيت في بيئة في وقتها غير سليمة، خضعت هذه المنظومة الأمنية للحسابات السياسية وعدم أخذ الواقع العراقي بشكل عملي، وبالتالي لم تكن منظومة أمنية منسجمة ومتكاملة من أجل الهدف، وكان هذا أدى إلى ضعف هذه المنظومة الأمنية. التسليح، نعم كان تسليح للمنظومة الأمنية، ولكن تسليح لا يرتقي إلى المهمة وهي مكافحة الإرهاب. كان تسليح قد يكون تسليح تقليدي، وبقى الجيش العراقي لحد أيام أو أشهر قليلة قادمة حتى بدون غطاء جوي، وهذه مشكلة بالنسبة إلى قدرات الجيش العراقي وإمكانيته في ردع المشكلة أو في التصدي للمشكلة. طبعا المنظومة الأمنية بالتأكيد لم تكن مستقلة استقلالا نهائيا، لأنه الجانب الأمني أو العمل الأمني يفترض فيه الاستقلالية في قراره وفي أدائه وفي انتماءاته، أن تكون منظومة وطنية تتقيد في الأوامر من الجهات العليا اللي نص عليها القانون والدستور، ولكن أيضا كانت المنظومة الأمنية خاضعة ومخضعة للحسابات السياسية لسبب أو لآخر. المناطق كان فيها حاضنة للإرهاب، في بعض المناطق كانت هنالك حواضن، وهذا كانت سبب رئيس حقيقة في جرأة داعش واحتضان داعش والتعاون مع داعش، سواء كانت خلايا نائمة أو خلايا متحركة. ولعله لحد اليوم في بعض المناطق هنالك حواضن تساعد داعش في مخططاتها. مخططات داعش أيضا كانت جزء من المشكلة، لأنه داعش واللي هو الجيل الأكثر خطرا والأكثر تطرفا للقاعدة وأعوانها كانت مخططاتها تنوي لإلغاء الحدود ولتكوين دولة وفيها عمود اقتصادي وفيها حكومة وفيها وزراء وفيها مستشارين، وبالتالي كان طموح داعش أن يتحقق هذا الشيء، وبدأت على ضوء المعطيات. الفساد الإداري والمالي ومشكلة العراق الأعم ومشكلة المؤسسة الأمنية بشكل خاص، سواء كان في فيما سمي بالفضائيين، أو سواء كان حقيقة في يصل إلى رزق الجندي، أو الفساد الإداري في التسليح والتجهيز، أو الفساد المالي والإداري في كثير من المفاصل. هذا خلى المقاتل الجندي أو الضابط لا يتمسك بشكل قوي وبشكل حقيقي بالهدف المطلوب من عنده. فكان الفساد الإداري والمالي هو جزء كبير من المشكلة التي سببت الوهن والضعف في المنظومة الأمنية. طبعا ترتبت النتائج على ضوء هذه المعطيات، وتم إسقاط عدد من المحافظات العراقية واللي بعضها لا يزال لحد الآن. وعلى ضوء هذا عمت الفوضى وكثرت الجريمة في المناطق المحتلة لعدم وجود إدارات محلية منتخبة ومكلفة بهذا الواجب، وخلقت بيئة سياسية أيضا معقدة لا تستطيع أن تتخذ قرار أو تصنع قرار، لأنه الحكومات المحلية وحتى الحكومة المركزية الأهم اليوم عندها هو أهم أنه إخراج داعش، وليس الأهم أنه يعني إفضاء الصفة الرسمية لهذه المناطق، لأنه هي محتلة أصلا. حقيقة المشكلة الأخرى أنه هنالك مشاكل برزت اجتماعية وإنسانية. مشاكل الاجتماعية في داخل هذه المحافظات أو داخل هذه المناطق، هنالك من اصطف جانب داعش، وهنالك من بقى تحت سيطرة داعش، وهو الجزء الأعم والأهم، يعني مرغما مجبرا تحت سيطرة داعش. وهنالك من تصدى لداعش وقاتل. كثير من العشائر الكريمة وأبناء المدن في هذه المناطق هي قاتلت داعش ووقفت ضد داعش مع الجيش العراقي ومع البيشمركة ومع الحشد ومع العشائر العراقية. كان هنالك موقف للجميع وقوات التحالف الدولي بإسنادها في مختلف سواء الإسناد اللوجستي أو المعلوماتي أو الإسناد الجوي، ولكن حدثت هنا أزمة اجتماعية التي ستبين آثارها بعد إخراج داعش. الأزمة الإنسانية التي أفرزتها داعش طبعا اللي هي انهيار البنى التحتية وتدمير البنى التحتية في هذه المناطق، وكذلك مصادر الطاقة ومصادر المياه وممتلكات المواطنين ونزوح الملايين الذين حقيقة سببوا إحراج للحكومة المركزية وكذلك حكومة الإقليم التي تحملت الجزء الكبير من بسبب عودة النازحين أو بسبب إيواء النازحين ورعايتهم وحمايتهم. عندما نأتي إلى الحلول ونتكلم عن حلول استراتيجيك، يجب أن نفرق بين إخراج داعش عسكريا والقضاء على داعش على المستوى الاستراتيجي. أما إخراج داعش فهو عمل عسكري معنية بها المنظومة الأمنية العراقية بكل تفاصيلها وإسنادها من التحالف الدولي، وأكيد يكون عمل عسكري يتوخى الميدانية والدقة والتسليح والتجهيز. ولكن القضاء على داعش وهو الهدف الذي يجب جميعا أن نتوقف عنده في المدى المتوسط وحتى المدى البعيد، هو تشترك فيه كل دول المنطقة ودول الإقليم في ترويض الخطاب السياسي والخطاب الديني، في قطع الاتصالات، في قطع وسائل الإعلام، في قطع الإمدادات، في المقاتلة كلا حسب حقيقة جغرافيته وحسب وضعه وحسب إسناده، لأنه حتى لا نكرر مسألة القاعدة. القاعدة خرجت من العراق من 2007 إلى 2010، وكان هنالك عمل عسكري لقوات متعددة الجنسيات في وقتها والقوات العراقية والبيشمركة، ولكن عادت في الجيل الأكثر تطرفا والأكثر لؤما وأكثر وقعا على العراق، لأنه العمل العسكري وحده حقيقة لا يكفي. الإرهاب اليوم هو خطر عالمي، وبالتالي يتطلب عمل استراتيجي في تكامل كل مقومات هذا العمل. يراد بناء منظومة أمنية أو إعادة هيكلة المنظومة الأمنية بشكل أصح، لأنه الأمن اليوم يفترض أن يستخدم تقنيات الأمن في مستوى التسليح والتجهيز، لأنه حرب الإرهاب ليس فقط دبابات وجنود وطائرات. حرب الإرهاب يعتمد على المعلومات ومكافحة هذه المعلومات يعتمد على الاتصالات، يعتمد على التقنيات، وبالتالي يجب أن يرتقي التسليح والتجهيز للمنظومة الأمنية العراقية إلى تقنيات الأمن اللي هي مختصة بحرب الإرهاب وليس بالحرب النظامية. إيراد تفعيل الدور الرقابي والقضائي الذي كان حقيقة متواضعا، دوره متواضعا في الفترة السابقة في كتم أنفاس الفاسدين وقطع الطريق على الفاسدين ومكافحة الفساد بشكل جدي وبشكل قوي، لأنه الفساد اليوم المالي والإداري أضعف البنية الدولة العراقية بشكل عام، وأيضا أهدر الثقة بين المواطن والدولة، لأنه كثير من الأموال اليوم أموال المواطن العراقي هي حقيقة في جيوب الفاسدين. المصالحة الوطنية، أنا ذكرت قبل قليل أنه حدثت مشاكل اجتماعية كبيرة. احنا كنا نتكلم عن مصالحة وطنية تهم كل العراقيين، بعضها تشريعات وبعضها إجراءات من قبل الحكومة، ولكن بعد 9/6/2014 لا، الموضوع اختلف كثيرا، وتركت آثار داعش، ستترك آثار كبيرة داخل القرية الواحدة. هنالك اتجاهات، وداخل المدينة الواحدة وداخل المنطقة أو كأقاليم أو مناطق بالعراق، مناطق شمالية، مناطق جنوبية، وسط منطقة إقليم، وبالتالي حدثت هنالك مشاكل أو ترتبت هنالك آثار، فيجب أن تكون مصالحة محلية مدروسة ومعدة كورقة. ومن جانبنا كرئاسة جمهورية بتكليف من السيد رئيس الجمهورية لمستشاريه سعادة السفير والإخوان الآخرين اطلعوا عليها كثيرا، وهي ورقة ناضجة وتحتوي حقيقة على كل هذه التوقعات أو الآثار التي ستترتب بعد خروج داعش. ويفترض، لأنه المصالحة في ديالى تختلف عن المصالحة في الموصل، وتختلف عن المصالحة في كركوك، وتختلف عن المصالحة في آمرلي، وبالتالي من المصالحة وطنية بشقين، هو المصالحة الوطنية في العراق والمصالحة الوطنية للمناطق اللي سميناها مصالحة محلية. عودة النازحين، طبعا النازحين اليوم في وضع حقيقة وضع مزري ووضع صعب، رغم الجهود الكبيرة والموفقة من قبل من قبل الإقليم حقيقة اللي كان دوره كبير في إيواء العدد الأكبر، والأمم المتحدة أيضا، وكذلك دور الحكومة الاتحادية من خلال وزارة الهجرة والمهجرين. ولكن عودة النازحين طبعا تتطلب جهد من الدولة. أولا هو تأمين الوضع الأمني الداخلي لهذه المناطق. أنا ما أرجع نازحين أرجع ناس والوضع الأمني هو ما مؤمن وما محصن كالطريقة، يعني لأنه لدينا قوات أمنية داخلية لا تقل عن 20,000 شرطي على الأقل في الأمن الداخلي معنيين في هذه المحافظات، في كل المحافظة. مطلوب تأهيل هذه القوات الأمنية، مطلوب هذه القوات الأمنية يكون لها دور في ردع أي هجوم متوقع أو تكرار هجوم متوقع من قبل داعش أو فصائل الإرهاب، وبالتالي نكون أمام تأمين للوضع الأمني والوضع الإنساني للنازحين حين عودتهم. موضوع داعش حقيقة بدون تكافل، بدون تكامل بين كل المؤسسة الأمنية المدعومة والمغطاة والمؤتمرة بأوامر صناع القرار السياسي حسب الدستور والقانون، بالتأكيد نبقى نراوح طبعا وبالتنسيق مع التحالف الدولي الذي يقدم الجهد اللوجستي ويقدم الغطاء الجوي لقواتنا. واليوم هنالك عمل نوعي على الأرض في الرمادي وفي صلاح الدين، ومطلوب حقيقة هذا العمل النوعي يعزز ويكون له سان صاحب القرار السياسي وكذلك الإعلام وصناع القرار، حتى نكون أمام فعلا توقعات وقرار حازم في إخراج داعش من الأرض العراقية. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I think you sketched out for us the factors that actually make it difficult for Baghdad to fight ISIS. I would like now to proceed with our next speaker, Please, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, let me say, as the others have, thank you, Delaware, for inviting us today and for creating this forum, and also for creating the Middle East Research Institute, which I think is a tremendous asset for Iraq and for the region. Let me also take this opportunity, as the other panelists have, to express my personal condolences for the loss of Dr. Ahmed Chalabi. I had the honor to work with Dr. Chalabi in his capacity as chairman of the Budget Committee during this time that I've been in Iraq. And he has been a vigorous leader, a political and intellectual leader in the parliament, and I really benefited from the opportunity to work with him. So my condolences go out to his family. And let me also just say how honored I am to be on this panel with the Deputy Prime Minister and with Dr. Sherwan and with David Pollack, who's, of course, one of the really gifted thinkers about the issues we're talking about today coming from Washington, D.C. So thank you very much. My message today is that Daesh is losing. Daesh is losing this conflict, and Daesh is going to lose. And there's a very good article, very good blog piece by Michael Knights, a colleague of David's this morning, saying that Daesh is losing, and that actually one of the things that the United States and coalition partners and the Iraqi government have failed to do is explain to the public that Daesh is losing. So, Delaware, thank you for giving me this opportunity today to explain to the people who are here today that Daesh is losing the war. If you look at where we were 14 months ago and compare it to where we are today, it's two completely different pictures. There were reports 14 months ago when I was preparing to come out here that Daesh was banging on the doors of Baghdad. And of course, those were a little bit sensational and a little bit breathless. But the fact is, there was a perception that Daesh could come all the way to Baghdad. Today, Daesh is nowhere near Baghdad. Today, Daesh is in a state of retreat. The Iraqi security forces, supported by the Popular Mobilization Forces, supported by the coalition, have defeated Daesh in every single head-to-head confrontation in recent weeks and months. This recent victory in Beji is a significant victory. In many ways, American military leaders were viewing Beji the way that we viewed Kobani last year, because the enemy kept pouring human resources, kept pouring fighters, and some of their best fighters, into Beji. And the coalition, of course, has been carrying out airstrikes in Beji for several months. You know, our military leaders think that we've killed several hundred Daesh fighters in the vicinity of Beji since August. But this recent campaign, which brought really significant forces to bear against Daesh and is in the process now of clearing Daesh from the whole vicinity of Beji, is a significant victory. And I think we really need to give credit to the Popular Mobilization Forces, who were a big part of that force, but also who I think made significant sacrifices in terms of casualties and martyrs, and we need to acknowledge that. So that's a big win. This is also the first time since the beginning of the conflict when the security forces, with the support of the coalition, has been able to bring the fight to Daesh in multiple points of contact throughout Iraq and northern Syria. So today we have the well-publicized actions going on in Sinjar, the recent victory in Beji, which is being followed up with clearing operations, and a very intense Iraqi security force operation in Ramadi, which is making steady progress, again, with consistent U.S. and coalition air support. So this is causing the enemy to no longer have the ability to move resources freely around the country. I think, Kubad, you made a good point about the problem of movement between Syria and Iraq, but that situation is changing. Now it's very difficult to move, it's less easy, and after the Sinjar operation, it'll be much less easy to move forces between northern Syria and Iraq. And that's because of the pressure that all the key players are putting on Daesh throughout the theater, both in Syria and in eastern Syria, not only in the north, but along the Deir el-Zor corridor to Al-Qaim, and then again in Beji, in Sinjar, and in Ramadi. I think, too, what we've seen is, with the recent very successful Peshmerga operation in Hawija, which rescued 70 hostages, this has also shown that the Iraqi security forces, with the support of the coalition, can go into the heart of Daesh territory and score a stunning military victory. And that victory has not only saved the lives of 70 hostages, that victory has produced extraordinary amount of insight into what Daesh is able to do and how it's operating. And that's what we find, is that these operations give us insight into the fact that inside of Daesh, the organization is crumbling. And both the Deputy Prime Minister and Dr. Shawan talked about the attitude of the public towards Daesh, where Daesh has a presence. And whatever happened last summer, in the summer of 2014, what we saw in the spring, when Daesh was able to enter Ramadi, was that nobody wanted to live with Daesh. Nobody wanted to stay with Daesh. Anybody who could get out of Ramadi got out. There's an absolute political rejection of Daesh across the board within Iraq and even outside of Iraq, even among Iraqis who are living outside of Iraq, who maybe 15 months ago, 18 months ago, were a little bit sympathetic, now recognize that Daesh is a pure evil for Iraq and it has to go. So there really is no political support for Daesh inside of Iraq or outside. And I never see any of this political support. So this is another reason why Daesh is going to fail. 13 months ago, the president appointed General John Allen, a U.S. four-star Marine general who had extensive experience inside of Iraq, to be our special envoy to establishing a coalition against Iraq. And this coalition now boasts 62 member nations. Many of these countries are participating directly in the fight inside of Iraq. 17 countries are participating militarily in the fight against Iraq. All the countries have found different ways to participate. And they've agreed on a set of lines of effort that are aimed at defeating Daesh not only here inside of Iraq, but also internationally. It includes cutting off Daesh finances. And by the way, amidst all of the recent reporting about the fighting in Beji and the fighting in Ramadi and the Hawija operation, I think the media has missed out on a very important operation carried out by the coalition in this same time period, which has decimated the Daesh oil infrastructure in Syria, which, as we know, has been a major source of its finances. So this bombing campaign has taken out key refining and processing capabilities that has enabled Daesh to maintain a profitable oil enterprise. That's gone today. And restoring it is going to be very, very difficult. So this 62-nation coalition is attacking Daesh's finances. It's attacking the foreign fighter flow. More than 20 countries have now adopted legislation which makes it illegal to travel through to Syria or Iraq to support Daesh. This is all new legislation that has emerged in the last year. That's significant. Also, because of the military advances against Daesh in Syria, the channels for foreign fighter flows into Syria have really been significantly reduced, enabling the Turkish government, which has been an active participant in blocking foreign fighters, to better control and interdict those foreign fighters. So what we're seeing, according to our analysts, is we're seeing a significant reduction in the flow of foreign fighters coming into Syria. And indeed, what Daesh is telling foreign fighters is, don't come to Syria anymore, it's too hard, go someplace else. Now that someplace else is a problem we're going to have to deal with as well. But this is good news for Syria, for the theater here in Syria and Iraq. The coalition also has mounted a significant effort to counter the Daesh message. And what we've learned, of course, is that Daesh does have tremendous expertise in manipulating social media, and they are able to attract a certain group of people. But we can also counter that message, and we can show young people that coming to Syria is not going to be the fun adventure that Daesh has promised you. So there's been tremendous progress in messaging, and this also reflects a genuine international effort. The Emiratis are now leading the messaging subcommittee of the coalition by creating a new center which is countering the Daesh message in cooperation with other coalition partners. So on all these lines of effort, not only and you're right, I think, Kabad, to say that this is not just a military effort. On all these lines of effort, in addition to the military effort, Daesh is losing. It's losing credibility in the Muslim world and the Arab world, and it's being seen to be what it is, which is just a brutal criminal gang. We still face tremendous challenges, of course, but one thing that gives me confidence, again, in the military campaign is our ability to adapt, and the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga's ability to adapt. 6 months ago, about the time that His Excellency Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi visited Washington, and it was followed soon after by a visit by President Barzani, the biggest challenge facing the Iraqi security forces were these armored VBIEDs, what we call vehicle-borne truck bombs. They were very difficult to stop. They're armored. They come barreling down on the soldiers. They had devastating effect, both in terms of creating casualties and in terms of psychologically. But today, those VBIEDs, those vehicle-borne truck bombs, are having a much less significant effect on the Iraqi security forces, both up here in the region and also in the campaigns in Beji and Ramadi. What changed? The United States and the coalition partners immediately stepped up and provided anti-armor shoulder-held rockets to the security forces in Iraq and the region. And these AT-4 shoulder-held rockets, as well as the Milan system, which has been donated by the Germans, have been extremely effective in neutralizing the vehicle-borne IEDs. A couple weeks ago in Ramadi, in an effort to break the spirit of the Iraqi security force campaign on Ramadi, the enemy sent 7 vehicle-borne IEDs at the 10th Division headquarters just north of the city. 7 VBIEDs all at the same time. The Iraqi security forces eliminated 4 with their shoulder-held rockets. U.S. airstrikes took out 1, and that's another good news story because our Air Force has become much more expert at identifying and precisely taking these vehicle-borne IEDs out by destroying them. We're also, by the way, becoming very much more expert and effective as we develop our intelligence apparatus to take out the VBIED factories. And we've had tremendous success in destroying VBIED factories, both in the northern front and around Fallujah, and Hawija, and in Ramadi. So we took out one, disoriented by what was going on around him. One of the suicide truck drivers drove his truck into a ditch and self-destructed. And then one VBID actually broke through, and thank God it was a dud. So this, and to send 7 vehicle-borne IEDs, 7 truck bombs at this headquarters at the same time represented a significant investment by Daesh, and it was defeated. And this is happening. These sort of micro episodes are happening on the battlefield around Iraq all the time. So this is what gives me confidence to say today that Daesh is losing. I think another way to ensure that Daesh is losing is, as His Excellency the Deputy Prime Minister suggests, is we need to think about the aftermath of Daesh. And again, I think that the government in Baghdad has taken significant steps to prepare for stabilization and reconstruction. And indeed, following the important victory in Tikrit last spring, we're now seeing that Tikrit has been resettled. 80% of the population of Tikrit, which had been completely vacated as of last April, has now returned to that city. And today we're seeing reports that people are returning to the village of Yathrib, which had been an area which had not yet been resettled and had been an area of political conflict. Similarly, when you meet with His Excellency the Governor of Anbar, Sohaib al-Rawi, he's already set up his stabilization planning center in the international zone in close cooperation with the Office of the Prime Minister and other government offices in Iraq. So the idea of being able to move into these communities as soon as they're cleared of Daesh, to stabilize them, to provide immediate services, and ensure that people can return quickly, this is a big plus. And I think this will also foster greater reconciliation as people, because what people really want in Anbar and what people really want in Nineveh province, as well as in Salahuddin province and Diyala, is the right to return home and the right to return to a peaceful life. And I think that's what we can help to, and that's what we can work to provide. So again, thank you very much, Dilara, for your kind invitation. It's great to be here, and look forward to hearing from you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. U.S. Ambassador. I think you gave us a very detailed picture about how the military affairs evolve on the ground. I would like now to proceed with our next panelist, please.
Thank you very much. Shukran jazilan, zor spas, min dulum khosha, balam zimani kurdi asan niya. So I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to switch to my native English, which I think will be easier for me and better for all of you. And I'm going to try to be very brief because I'm honored to be on this panel, and especially so because I agree with most of the points raised by my fellow panelists, and so I'm not going to repeat them. What I'm going to try to do in a few minutes is to say some things that have not yet been said about this very complicated and difficult, but as the ambassador just pointed out, I think winning battle against Daesh. So first let me say that when it comes to the Kurdistan region of Iraq in particular, if you compare the situation today with what it was a year and a half ago, when Daesh was literally at the gates of Erbil, and I know this myself from personal observation here, I think it's fair to say that not only has the Kurdistan region and the Peshmerga succeeded in pushing Daesh back, but it has benefited from a major increase in international support in that battle, something that we never saw before. We are now seeing direct U.S. military support for the Peshmerga along with our other allies in the coalition. And we are seeing the direct presence of US military and intelligence teams supporting this fight against Daesh right here in Kurdistan, something that we never saw before. And I think that this is an important signal of the importance of the Kurdish partners that the United States and the coalition and Iraq have here and also across the border in Syria. That's number one. Number two, I want to say something about some of the other countries that are active in both Iraq and Syria, because I think the picture is actually very mixed, and it's important to make that point publicly. I think specifically if we look at Russian and Iranian intervention in Iraq and in Syria, it is true that their forces and their advisors and their military support and weapons are having some benefits in the campaign against Daesh in both countries. More so here in Iraq, much less so, I'm afraid, across the border in Syria. But at the same time, I think that Russian and Iranian intervention also have the effect of aggravating, making worse, some of the sectarian divisions that are responsible for the rise of Daesh in the first place. And therefore, I think we need to be very clear about the ways in which this aspect of foreign intervention is not always helpful. And we need to be very clear that it is the coalition with the United States and the Iraqi government and the government of the KRG and our friends, such as they are, across the border in Syria and the many other countries, Arab, European, and others. It is that coalition that I think has the greatest promise of defeating Daesh, not through more intervention by Russia or Iran. Let me say something about Turkey as well. And we're going to hear, I'm delighted, from a very senior official of the Turkish government here at this conference soon. I want to say that I think Turkish policy has improved in many respects, as the ambassador pointed out, when it comes to stopping cross-border recruits, supplies, funds for Daesh, whether in Iraq or in Syria. But at the same time, the most recent indications of the Turkish government's policy toward Kurds, whether in Turkey or across the Turkish-Syrian border, are very troubling. The peace process between the Turkish government and the PKK has broken down. The Turkish government is very suspicious of the Syrian Kurdish PYD and YPG groups that are actually very important partners now for the United States and for Iraq in the fight against Daesh, in Raqqa and in other places in Syria, not too far from the Iraqi border. And this is an issue that if we are going to be fully successful against Daesh in the future, as I think we have been in the last year, this is an issue that needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. I want to also mention the internal political situation right here in Kurdistan. The fact is, as all of you know, but nobody has said out loud, that there is an internal political crisis here in the KRG today, and that some important elements of the people and of the political spectrum, specifically the Goran Party and its supporters, have recently been excluded from government and from much of the public space right here in Kurdistan. And I think, personally, it's my own personal view, in order for the full effect of the popular revulsion against Daesh and the popular mobilization against Daesh, whether in Kurdistan or anywhere else in Iraq, to be effective, in order for us to win this fight decisively, it is going to require an inclusive political approach that recognizes and respects and compromises and shares power with all the positive actors in the society. I think from my private conversations, there is a willingness here in the KRG to reach a compromise on the issues that divide the government right now and Goran and others. I think there is a willingness on all sides to reach a compromise, and I hope, for the sake of Kurdistan and for the sake of our common battle against Daesh, that again, that compromise can be reached sooner rather than later. I do want to say that American influence on this aspect of our common struggle against extremism and terrorism, against ISIS or Daesh, American influence on this particular aspect is much more limited than many of you probably think, or than I often hear in conversations all around the region. The United States cannot determine what kind of political compromises may be reached here inside the KRG or in Syria or in Iraq as a whole. We can play a constructive role where we're asked to do so, but only up to a certain point. After that point, it is your responsibility, not the American responsibility, to manage and reconcile your internal differences, whether at the Iraqi federal level or at the KRG level, in order to win this long war. I want to say a few brief words about ways in which this winning battle can be won even faster and better. And here I'm going to echo the suggestions of my good friend and colleague Mike Knights, also from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who is much more of a military expert than I am. The tempo of airstrikes can be increased, I believe. The targeting of these airstrikes can be improved so that there are not so many political constraints on that targeting. I know that we in the United States government and military are legitimately and properly very concerned about civilian casualties and about the accuracy of the intelligence that we have before we conduct any airstrikes. But frankly, I also think it is probably not necessary for every single airstrike to require the approval of lawyers in the White House. And I think we would have a better strategy and certainly better tactics if those rules were improved. I think we also need to pay more attention to the way in which weapons and other forms of support are delivered to the frontline troops here in Iraq and also across the border in Syria in this fight against Daesh. Too often, the weapons not only have to be approved by the Baghdad government, which is fair enough, but also spend a lot of time sitting in warehouses at military bases or airfields and don't get to the troops on the front lines, whether Peshmerga or Iraqi government forces, who really need those weapons right away. And this is one small but important, urgent aspect of U.S. policy and of U.S. coordination with our partners here in Iraq and across the border in Syria that I think could very usefully be improved quickly. I want to say just a few words about the really important issue of popular support or lack of popular support for Daesh. And one aspect of this issue that is not very well understood, but that I have personally spent a lot of time looking into, is whether or not Daesh has significant popular support, not just in Iraq or in Syria, but in the broader Sunni Muslim world, here in the region and even far beyond, in the Gulf, or further afield, in Jordan or in Egypt, or even further afield in other major Muslim countries where you hear so much sensational reporting about foreign fighters flocking to Daesh. How much support does Daesh actually have in those societies? Or in Turkey? And the answer is, based on actual public opinion polls that I have personally conducted in all of those places, the answer is, I am happy to say, and to tell you, in case you haven't heard this before, that Daesh actually has almost no popular support, whether in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Jordan or Egypt or Turkey or any other Muslim country, Sunni or otherwise, where it is possible to measure this question. The percentage of people in any of those countries who express any sympathy at all for Daesh is less than 10%, usually less than 5%. It's a tiny minority of the Muslim world and of the Sunni Muslim world and of the Arab Sunni Muslim world. Daesh is not the wave of the future, even as Sunni Arabs perceive it, whether in Iraq or in Syria or anywhere else. And that, in the long term, I think, is going to be one of the important reasons why, beyond the military effort, beyond the public diplomacy or social media war, beyond anything else that anybody does, that is one of the reasons why we will win this fight against Daesh. And so, with that observation, I will conclude my remarks. And again, thank you so much for Dr. Dlauer and MERI for hosting us, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you. And now I welcome the opportunity for open discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this analytically rich presentation, in particular because you brought in aspects of international and regional politics. So thank you very much for that. Before I open the floor for more questions, I would like to ask one question each one of you. And I would like to start first with His Excellency, Mr. Kubat El-Abani. So you referred to the operation, the Mosul operation, and I was wondering, what would it take for the KRG to decide its participation in this operation? What are the favorable conditions you would like to see for the KRG actually committing to this operation?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the remarks of my fellow panelists. We have made it very clear to our colleagues in Iraq and our friends in the coalition that we stand ready and have begun our own collective, when I say our own, I mean Iraqi plans and operations for liberation of Mosul, liberation of other parts of Iraq. So that is not a topic that we in Kurdistan are mulling over. Do we participate? Do we not participate? We want to make this absolutely clear. The liberation of Mosul is strategically important to the success of the war against Daesh, to the safety and security of Kurdistan, and to the political stability of Iraq. That said, we have questions, and we have presented those questions in the appropriate format and in the appropriate forum. This is not just, again, about a military operation to liberate Mosul. This has to be a comprehensive plan that involves the political solution, the administration of Mosul the day after, how this ties into a broader tax strategy against Daesh that, again, involves Iraq, that may involve Syria. Really, this has to be a well thought out plan. Again, I do not have any fears about the inability of combined Iraqi, Kurdistani, and coalition forces to liberate Mosul. But I do have questions about the ability of this collective grouping to stabilize Mosul the day after, to administer and govern Mosul the day after, and to ensure that we do not lose Mosul after we put in so much effort to reclaim it. This is definitely not something that we in Kurdistan can do alone. We have made this absolutely clear. You will not see Kurds unilaterally, independently driving into Mosul. This will further exacerbate a political and ethnic and sectarian dynamic in the country. So this has to be, again, a coordinated plan. We have a joint coordination center here in Kurdistan. We have great coordination with our colleagues in the Iraqi government with increasing level of support and coordination from the coalition. But again, I urge the holistic strategy to deal with it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Al-Wali, you talked before about the reconciliation that has to follow, that has to take place in the post-ISIS era, and I would like you to talk more about what it takes for this reconciliation to be successful. Can you become more specific about it? What is Baghdad ready to do in order to re-engage the Sunni community?
نعم، بالتأكيد المصالحة هو عامل مهم ورئيسي في اليوم في العراق. يعني في الفترة السابقة كان هنالك مشروع مصالحة عراقية متبنى من قبل رئيس الوزراء ومجلس الوزراء، ولكن هذه المرة صنف الملف كونه ملف سياسي وليس تنفيذي. وعندما يكون ملف سياسي هو السيد رئيس الجمهورية معني في كونه هو جزء مهم من السلطة التنفيذية حسب المادة 68 من الدستور، وبالتالي صار اتفاق شبه نهائي بين الرئاسات الثلاث أنه تعد ورقة لهذه المصالحة، وكلف السيد رئيس الجمهورية هذه الورقة. هذه المرة هي عملية أكثر مما هي مجرد يعني موظفين ومكاتب غير ضرورية. هذه المرة المصالحة تذهب في العمق للمشاكل، سواء كانت مشاكل محلية أو مشاكل وطنية عامة، لأنه بعد 9/6/2014 استحدثت كثير من المشاكل مثل ما ذكرت داخل المدن وداخل القرى، مشاكل ذات طابع ديني، ذات طابع مذهبي، ذات طابع قومي، ذات طابع اجتماعي أيضا بين العشائر نفسها. على سبيل المثال عشيرة واحدة قسم قاتل داعش وقسم مع الأسف اصطف مع داعش، وبالتالي ستكون هنالك مشاكل على أثر خروج داعش وهي في طريقها إلى الخروج. وبالتالي هذا المشروع الآن صار شبه اتفاق أنه يكون ضمن لجنة تحضيرية من الرئاسات الثلاث، من رئيس الجمهورية، مكتب رئيس الجمهورية، وكذلك رئيس الوزراء ورئيس مجلس النواب، والاعتماد على الانفتاح على باقي المكونات، على باقي المحافظات، على أيضا على كل الطبقة السياسية الموجودة في المجتمع، والاعتماد حقيقة هنالك برنامج هادف قدم من قبل رئاسة الجمهورية، ونحن جادين في تنفيذه إن شاء الله في المرحلة القادمة، وسيكون إلى الأثر الكبير في أن يكون النسيج المجتمعي وحتى النسيج السياسي متكامل في إدارته إلى المحافظات، سواء في إدارة الملف الأمني أو إدارة الملف الإداري، لأنه حقيقة بدون المصالحة ستكون هنالك إرباك سياسي وارتباك سياسي مثل ما كان سابقا، ويمهد لدخول قد يكون جيل أشد وطأة علينا من داعش.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. U.S. Ambassador, I think your presentation before has a second reading, a more pessimistic one. I think there's a puzzle here. You described how many nations participate in this war against ISIS. You also talked about how the U.S. Is trying to curb its finances and also the military aid that has been getting, who knows exactly how. So the question would be, normally, an army that is bombarded by so many nations and there's so much determination from the international community to defeat ISIS, and also there are local actors that actually have many interests in defeating ISIS, how come ISIS is still a standing army? So the puzzle, how come ISIS is still standing, is a standing army in many areas in Iraq and Syria? The puzzle here is, despite all this effort, ISIS is still there. So is there any failure on the part of the coalition? Is there something that you could pinpoint in terms of what should change?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's an important question, and I appreciate the opportunity to answer it, because I think it does also reflect the concerns of many Iraqis. It's a question I hear a lot. And if I'm an Iraqi, and many times I feel like an Iraqi, I'd like to see this process go faster too. And so the impatience to see Daesh expelled from Iraq is genuine and authentic and real. And we need to respect that and, of course, capitalize on it. Now, when the United States came in, when the coalition came in, the Iraqi security forces were in disarray. They had retreated from Mosul. The question was whether they'd be able to do what they would be able to do. And now what we see is that the coalition has now trained over 12,000 Iraqi security forces. Now we're also training, by the way, hundreds of Iraqi police through the Italian Carabinieri. So that training process is not something that can happen overnight. That rehabilitation of the Iraqi security forces was not going to happen on a dime. And you're not going to win the war only with airstrikes. You need to have the ground component. And we've seen that ground component get stronger and stronger over the past year, not only because of the improvement in the Iraqi security forces, which is a direct result of the coalition training, but also, as I said before, we need to give credit to the popular mobilization, which I think has made a significant contribution to this victory in Beijing. So, and of course we can't omit to mention the Peshmerga. But even our Kurdish colleagues will acknowledge that the Peshmerga has also improved its capability over the last 12 months, benefiting from the airstrikes and using the airstrikes expertly to their advantage, but also improving their equipping and their training and their protocols, because no one had seen an enemy like this before. So the other thing that I think doesn't get mentioned enough, and this will be proven in the fullness of time, is that Daesh has now been hollowed out. The structure is much weaker than it was before. Again, 14 months ago, they were at the gates of Erbil. Now, the best they can do is retrench and defend the areas that they have. And of course, this defense is it's easier to defend than to attack, right? So, but what we're seeing is that Daesh is retreating into certain cities and building defenses to protect itself. So it's no longer able to launch significant, even insignificant offensives against the state of Iraq or up here in the region, or even significantly in Syria. So its resources are really being sapped, and you don't see it because it's hard to see into Daesh from outside. But we see it, and we hear it from the people when you talk to people who've found their way out of Mosul, or you talk to people who have found their way out of Hawija, or you talk to people who have found their way out of Ramadi. They say that Daesh is collapsing. So, you know, you don't have to believe me. Let's see where we are in 6 months. But I appreciate the impatience of the Iraqi and Kurdish people to want to have this over with, and we certainly support that sentiment. But let's also be clear. Some of the criticism of the coalition is not well-intentioned. Some of the criticism of the coalition is not about focusing on the fight against Daesh, but on focusing on what might come after. And I think what my president has done is he has said, we're going to focus on the fight against Daesh. That's the immediate challenge. And when we have defeated Daesh, when we have supported the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga to defeat Daesh, then we will leave. And we do not have an intention to build bases here. We have no intention to maintain ground forces. You know, we are not in combat here. We are supporting the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga and the popular mobilization with the tools that were asked of us and that we are giving. And it's also, I think, really important to remember, this will be my last point, is that everything that the United States is doing inside of Iraq, whether it's in the region or whether it's in the other parts of, in southern Iraq, everything we're doing is at the request of the government. And every airstrike is approved by the government. And everything we do is in partnership. And I just have to clarify one point, David, if you will. There's a legitimate debate about whether the airstrikes are too restrictive or not restrictive enough. I think anybody who's watched the airstrikes can see that some of the restrictions have eased as we've become more expert and more confident in our targeting and intelligence. And that's a natural evolution of the fight. But each strike does not have to be approved by lawyers in the White House.
I'm delighted to hear that.
Yeah, that's...
I think a year ago, or less than that, when I talked to people who were actually in charge of the targeting, that was what they were saying. Well, if that has changed, that's great.
And I think you can see...
So now let's have more.
So right, I mean, I think, again, with experience, with improved intelligence, with closer partnerships built up over the last 14 months, I think what we're seeing now is that the airstrikes are devastatingly effective on Daesh. And if we had a panel of Daesh members here today, I think they would say so.
Thank you very much, thank you. And Mr. David Pollock, you talked before about the role of Russia, and you said that it has a very negative role. Its intervention in Syria?
I said it had a mixed role.
A mixed role,
yes.
Okay. Then can you please focus more on Russia's role in Syria, because I think this is a very interesting topic, and I would like to understand how its intervention in Syria is actually feeding into the Iraqi, the war in Iraq against ISIS. How are the two interconnected?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that question. I have a lot about that in my notes, but I didn't want to talk too much about it because that's Syria, that's not Iraq. But now, since you asked, I will say a few things about that. In my opinion, and this is based on a careful study of what is actually happening across the border in Syria, Russian involvement in Syria is intended and actually is supporting the Assad regime. It is not part of the fight against Daesh. And the reason I say that is that 80% or more of the Russian airstrikes are directed at other targets, not at ISIS or Daesh targets in Syria. Every now and then, just for propaganda purposes, they will send an airplane to Raqqa or some other place where there might be some Daesh positions. But almost everything they do in Syria is against other anti-regime forces. Moderate, extremist, all different kinds, but not against Daesh. So they are there to support the Assad regime, and I would go even further. I would say that my analysis of Russian and Iranian intentions in Syria is not just to support the Assad regime, but to support Assad personally. Despite all of the conferences and all of the ink that has been spilled on this, I see absolutely no sign that Russia or Iran is prepared to dump Bashar al-Assad in order to end the civil war in Syria and focus the common fight against ISIS. So the United States and the coalition, and I believe Iraq, are faced with a real dilemma about what's happening across the border in Syria. If we fight against ISIS in Syria, we are in effect supporting the Assad regime. And if we say that there can be no ultimate solution to the problem of ISIS or Daesh until Assad is removed from Syria, from power in Syria, because he is a magnet for ISIS, then we have no way, honestly, of achieving that goal anytime soon. So we have a real problem. What should we do? Should we keep trying to get rid of Assad, or should we keep trying to get rid of ISIS in Syria, which actually keeps Assad in power or helps keep him in power? My own opinion, for what it's worth, is one thing at a time. First things first. Let's focus on getting rid of ISIS in Syria, even if that does temporarily help Assad stay in power. And then we'll try and have the Syrian people, or help the Syrian people, get rid of Bashar al-Assad and his regime, which will help eliminate the long-term threat of ISIS in Syria and everywhere else in the region. But the one point that I insist upon is that Russian and Iranian intervention in Syria, I'll say it one more time, is intended to support Assad, not to defeat ISIS.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for these comprehensive answers. Now we'll open the floor for more questions. Please be succinct. If you want to get a lot out of your speaker's answers, please be succinct and to the point. We don't want to have long descriptions and narratives. It's the speakers that answer and you ask the question. So please, I would like to start with the gentleman over there.
That'll be first.
زۆر سوپاس سیروان سیرینی ئەندامی ئەنجومەنی نوێنەرانی عێراق بەڕێگاوە جێم لە وتەکەی بەڕێزکار خوبا تاڵەبانی بوو شتێکی جوان بوو دەستخۆشی لێ دەکەم بەس معلومەیەک هەبوو لەسەر پەرلەمان پێم خۆش بوو ڕاستی بکەمەوە پێمانیە پەرلەمانی عێراق ڕێگری کردبی لە بەرنامەی ئیسلاحی عیبادی بەڵام ئەوەی کە لە نزیکەوە ئاگادارین زۆربەی زۆری ئەو پرۆژە چاکسازیانەی بەڕێز عیبادی بەبێ دراست و بەبێ ڕەچاوکردنی لایەنە دەستوری و قانونیەکان بووە و هەرچەندە لە یەکەمین ڕۆژ لە یەکەمین لەحزە بە حکمی لاوازی پەرلەمانیش و بە حکمی فشاری زادەش دەست بەجێ بڕیار درا لە ئەنجومەندا بۆ هەموو پرۆژەکەی بە تێکڕاینەک بند بەبن لە پەرلەمانیش بەبێ خوێندنەوە بەبێ دراسەکردن بۆیە دوێنێکە لە جەلسەی پێرێکە جارێکی تر ئەو دەسەڵاتیان لە عیبادی وەرگرتەوە لە پەرلەمانی عێراق ئەوە یەک دوو پرسیار بۆ بەڕێزان یەکیان بۆ بەڕێز باڵیۆزی ئەمریکا بەڕێز ستیوارت جۆنز حەزەکەم باسی ئەو چیرۆکە بکەم زۆر بە کوردی ببۆرن هەفتەیەک لەمە و بەر سەردانی بەرەکانی جەنگمان کرد زۆر بەداخەوە قایدی پێشمەرگە پێیوتین لە گوێر پێشمەرگەیەک ئیجازەی تەواو بوو دەبا کاتی بە واجبی تەواو بوو دەبا بگەڕە بەوە سلێمانی بەڵام وتیان 3 ڕۆژی تر لەوانەیە ڕاتب بێت وتی نەپارەم هەیە پێ بگەڕێمەوە و چاوەڕێ دەکەم 3 ڕۆژ تر لێرە دەبم بۆی موچەکە وەربگرم هەم پارەی تەکسیەکە پێ بدەم هەم بگەڕێمە ناو ماڵ و منداڵی خۆم بەڵام بەداخەوە لە خلالی ئەو 3 ڕۆژە ئەو پێشمەرگەی قارەمانە شەهید کرا بەدەستی داعش ئەمریکا پرسیارەکە لێرە ئەوەیە وڵاتی ئەمریکا و بەریتانیا و یوئێنیش چاودێر بوون لەسەر ڕێکەوتنی بەغدا و هەولێر و هەروەها تەسیری زۆریان هەیە ئایا کاتی ئەوە نەهاتیە فشارێک بخەنە سەر بەڕێز عیبادی بۆ ئەوەی هەنەبی استحقاقاتی پێشمەرگە بدام موچەی پێشمەرگە بدا لە کاتێک پێشمەرگە دەبینین لە جیاتی هەموو دنیا شەڕ دەکات پرسیاری دووەم بۆ بەڕێز دەڤید پۆڵاک بە کورتی
It's very clear. The question is very clear, I think. Thank you very much.
Yes, he said that in order to be successful in Kurdistan, you got a power sharing with your partners.
Please, sir. Your question was very clear.
Yeah,
thank you.
With the positive actors.
More people want
the
to
question
ask,
is, how about if your actors are not positive? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take one question from here. Yes.
السلام عليكم. سؤالي طبعا سيادة السفير الأمريكي، أريد أسأل هل التحالف الدولي جاد بالخلاص من داعش في العراق؟ لأن سنة 2003 يوم كان جاد وحول العراق إلى شيء ثاني، مع العلم كان العراق يملك جيش كبير وقوي، لكن في عدة أيام حقق ما يريده. اثنين، انه اريد ايضا سؤال ثاني، انه بما انه التحالف الدولي هو جاد يعني انه هدفه الخلاص من داعش، وايضا التحالف الرباعي بين روسيا وايران ايضا هو هدفه الخلاص من داعش، هذا هذه زين ليش ما يتعاونون للخلاص من داعش؟ ونرجوهم ايضا ان لا ينقلون الصراعات بين امريكا وروسيا داخل هذه المنطقه واثرها على الشعب السوري والعراقي، وشكرا.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like first to have some answers from our speakers. Mr. US Ambassador, would you like to? Oh, sorry. Would you like to respond to some of the questions?
I couldn't understand what she was saying. Sorry.
So I think
there was interference.
I think the question was more about the role of Russia and.
Okay, I got
repeat?
it.
But
Okay,
be succinct, please, because you see, questions are.
نعم، السؤال الأول أنه التحالف الدولي جاد الخلاص من الداعش، لأن الفترة طالت سنة صار والنفذ العراقيين صبرهم نفذ، يعني ما يتحقق الناس، يعني وصلت الحد يعني لحد الانفجار، وطال داعش يشكل خطر على دول العالم جميعا، وهناك كل من ينادي ويصيح انه احنا نحارب داعش. اليوم روسيا.
This is clear. The second question, you said you have a second question.
السؤال التالي، بما انه التحالف الدولي هو هدفه الخلاص من داعش، وكذلك اليوم التحالف الروسي الإيراني السوري العراقي أيضا هو ضد داعش. زين لماذا لا يتعاونون؟ واللي أيضا نترجى أنه لا تحولون الصراعات والخلافات بين
Thank you very much.
العراق وسوريا.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Would you like to talk a bit about this?
I would just say, as I said earlier, I think that the coalition is very committed to defeating Daesh and expelling Daesh from Iraq and Syria. We have a 62-member coalition that is confronting Daesh militarily, but also on numerous lines of effort, attacking their financing, their messaging, and all of their capabilities. And as I said also, I think that we've brought, the coalition has had tremendous effects in pushing Daesh back. And if you look at where Daesh was 14 months ago and where it is today, the trend is certainly in the right direction. And I can certainly understand impatience to see this mission completed, but it's going to require the Ramadi campaign to be completed, and then push up through the Euphrates River Valley, and then, of course, we're all looking forward to the Mosul campaign, which I expect will be joint, as the Deputy Prime Minister stated. So please understand there's no lack of resolve by the United States in this effort. In terms of the Russians and the Iranians, I mean, we have a 62-nation coalition. And, you know, we're willing to look for synergies between what we're trying to do to defeat Daesh and what the Russians and the Iranians are saying. But I think, as David said, our primary focus is defeating Daesh, and it's not clear to us that that's the primary focus of the Russian-Iranian group. And in fact, by sustaining the Assad regime, you sustain that symbiotic relationship between Assad and Daesh.
Thank you very much. Would someone else would like to comment on the questions or give an answer? Okay, then we proceed with more questions. Please.
Yes, thank you. But I have not the questions. I would like to say something because Mr. Pollack changed totally my mind. I have to talk something about problems in Middle East, but because of me only the one who is here and who can say about the position of Russian Federation, Russian government on the issue in Syria.
Can you please identify yourself?
Yes. My name is Edward, family Khachukayev. I'm Chechenian, and I representative the administration of President of Russian Federation here. Mm-hmm. And I would like to say you, because many people have an interest, what will do Russians in the Syria? The number one, Russian Federation came to Syria to help the legitimized regime of Bashar Assad. Number one. The second, Putin is a winner. All last years, 10, 15 years, he get a win even in Chechen Republic. Because you know, Chechenians are very crazy fighters, the most fighters in the world. But if Russians can get a win in Chechen Republic, he will very easy get a win even in Syria. ISIS is not a so important enemy for Russian soldiers. This is number two. Number third, ISIS is the enemy of the human civilization. And His Excellency, Ambassador of United States told that in coalition there are 62 or 63 members. Yes, but no Russians in your coalitions, and also no Chechenians. It is the bad side of these coalitions. But we have a plan, and Putin has a plan, and you will see, he will get a win. Nobody's know when it will be, in 3 months or in half year or in 1 year, because in Quran says that you cannot know the future. But we can plan, we can see, and we can make a prognosis. It will be very soon, very soon. And we will help to all citizens in Syria and Iraq, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to respond? Mr. David Pollack, okay, thank you. Some more questions? The gentleman there in the second row. Yeah.
تحدث السيد السفير عن معالجات لبعض السيارات المفخخة لدى داعش. طبعا يؤسفنا أن هذه المعالجات ممكن أن تتم من تاجر سلاح. اللي حصل في مناطقنا عملية الإنزال الأخيرة، طبعا نشكر القوات الأمريكية والقوات الخاصة من البيشمركة. لا توجد هناك قاعدة شعبية إطلاقا في مناطق جنوب غرب كركوك والموصل، وإلا أعداد ضئيلة جدا. الخطر الأكبر هو ما بعد داعش. هناك نفسيات، هناك دمرت المدارس، دمرت المنشآت. كيف يتعاملون مع هؤلاء الأطفال؟ ممكن هؤلاء الأطفال أن يستغلوهم في المستقبل. أما في موضوع التدخلات الإقليمية اللي دخلت في العراق وسوريا، احنا أيضا بسبب تأخر الولايات المتحدة عن اتخاذ إجراءات صحيحة في العراق. لو نسأل أي مواطن من الحاضرين وإمكانيات العسكرية واللوجستية والتطور التقني لدى القوات الأمريكية لأن لا تستطيع إخراج داعش من العراق، فهذا شيء مستحيل. الشيء المؤسف أن هناك 62 دولة كبرى ولديها إمكانيات عسكرية ومادية ولا تستطيع إخراج داعش، اللي هي عبارة عن عصابات من عدة دول، عصابات من الداخل ومن دول أخرى. لكن الذي يحصل هناك تباطل ربما استراتيجية الأمريكية نعم بعيدة المدى، مثل ما تفضلت الست. المواطن العراقي بعد لا يتحمل هذا الشيء. هناك العديد من النازحين أعدموا الناس في مناطقنا على أعمدة الكهرباء أمام ذويهم ومنع. أنا سؤالي بالنسبة لسياسة السفير، مثل هل هناك فترة محددة أو تغيير في السياسة الاستراتيجية الأمريكية لمعالجة موضوع داعش أم نبقى على هذا الحال؟ شكرا.
Thank you very much. I will take the gentleman here and then the gentleman in the back. First here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, MERI, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. I have a very straight and direct question to His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador. It's very obvious that one of the significant elements that keeps Daesh's momentum is the support and the financial capabilities that they have access to. What specific actions and steps have been taken by the coalition forces and the United States as the leader of that force to eradicate that support and that supply from the roads? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The gentleman on the back.
شكرا لمؤسسة الشرق الأوسط للبحوث. حقيقة سؤالي للسيد السفير، العراقيين طبعا نحن باعتبارنا ممثلين الشعب في مجلس النواب العراقي، العراقيين الكل يسألون، وهذا السؤال يطرح في الساحة العراقية جميعا: لماذا أمريكا والدول المتحالفة معها في حرب الخليج قضت على حكم النظام صدام حسين بأيام؟ لماذا أمريكا أكثر من سنة و5 أشهر وأكثر من 60 دولة مشاركة في هذا التحالف لا يستطيعون القضاء على هؤلاء العصابات الإجرامية الصغيرة إن صح التعبير؟ إذا قارنا هؤلاء العصابات في وقتها الجيش العراقي كان بقوة كبيرة وتم قضاء والوصول إلى بغداد. أما الآن لماذا هذه الضربات لا تكون ضربات حقيقة مباشرة؟ الشعب العراقي دائما يشكو بأن الضربات التحالف الدولي ليست ضربات دقيقة لعصابات داعش، بل إنها تخطئ المواقع. وكذلك أيضا هناك العراقيين يتحدثون بأن هناك أيضا بعض الدول في التحالف غير صادقة مع التحالف الدولي للقضاء على داعش. وشكرا.
Thank you very much. Can we have some responses? I think most of the questions are about US strategy in Iraq. A lot of criticism, many different thoughts, and
well, I think some people might. I'd like to hear more from my panelists. But I think again, your question is exactly as you said, reflective of the sentiment of the Iraqi people and the Iraqi street. And so, let me tell you that everything that the United States and everything that the coalition is doing inside of Iraq is exactly as was asked. And I think you recognize, and I recognize, that there's a good reason not to bring 80,000 US troops into Iraq to defeat Daesh. I think that would be a problem for Iraq, and it would be a problem for the United States. We think that we are defeating Daesh with this current strategy of precision airstrikes, supporting the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga and the popular mobilization. And this this strategy is working. And just to go back to your specific question about the finances, so there's some very specific things that we've done. Of course, we're working with central banks and ministries of finance around the region and around the world to make sure that Daesh is not able to launder its money. And in fact, we've had a very, very positive collaboration with the Central Bank of Iraq to make sure that certain exchange houses that seemed to have ties to Daesh are no longer able to get access to US dollars. That's a very specific technical measure that we're taking, behind the scenes all the time. The other thing that we have done is we have significantly struck the Daesh oil infrastructure, and this is what I was mentioning earlier. We've hit Daesh infrastructure before, but Daesh was able to repair it. This time we've struck precisely at the refining and processing capabilities inside of Syria. So this is taking products off the market and disabling Daesh's ability to sell those products, in many cases back to the regime. So third, we've identified Daesh's interest in stealing and marketing antiquities. And of course, we've built, through the coalition mechanism, we've ensured that any antiquities emerging from Syria or from Mosul are immediately interdicted and lead to criminal investigations of the ways that those items came into the market. There's a huge apparatus in Washington that's in close contact with governments around the world on all of these issues.
Mr. David Pollock, did you want to?
Since the ambassador invited additional comment, I want to say, in response to several of these questions, look, I'm not in the US government. This is just my own personal opinion. And as I said, I think that personally that there could be more airstrikes and that we could be doing things faster to deliver weapons to our Iraqi partners, yes. But at the same time, I agree with the ambassador that the United States doesn't want, and I think most Iraqis don't want, another 100,000 American troops here in this country. If we did that, we could fight better and faster against Daesh. But there would also be very negative consequences for Iraq, for the region, and for the United States. It is not the American responsibility anymore to be the main fighter in this war. It is the responsibility of Iraq, of Syria, of other countries in the region, of the international community, because, as my Russian friend said, Daesh is the enemy of all civilization. And so the United States should not be expected to win this war by itself or in a matter of just a few weeks or a few months. This is something that we need to do together, and it will take more time, but it is going to succeed. And I want to say something also about the issue of civilian casualties. If we were willing, as the Assad regime and its supporters are willing, to bomb cities indiscriminately and kill hundreds or thousands of innocent Iraqi or Syrian civilians, as they are doing every day in Syria, maybe we could eliminate Daesh more quickly, but the price would be too high. The price would be thousands of dead Iraqi and Syrian women and children killed by American weapons. We don't want to do that, and I don't think you should want us to do that either. Thank you.
Mr. Al-Wail.
بدءا ودي أن أعلق على كلمة الصديق من جمهورية الشيشان أشاد بضراوة المقاتلين الشيشان. يعني احنا عندنا صنفين من هذا المقاتلين الشيشان، إذا كانوا مع الروس يقاتلون داعش فهذا أكيد شيء ممدوح يعني وجيد، ولكن هنالك مقاتلين شيشان قادة لداعش يقتلون الشعب العراقي. أتمنى لا يقصد الصنف الثاني، أن يقصد الصنف الأول. الله. الموضوع الآخر بالنسبة إلى روسيا. روسيا لا تقوم بمهمة مقاتلة داعش في سوريا، واحنا ذكرنا على المدى الاستراتيجي احنا نريد انهاء داعش او القضاء على داعش، وليس الهدف العسكري فقط اخراج داعش من العراق، لانه اليوم داعش متواصله عبر الحدود، ماكو حدود مثل ما قال سيد قباد انه الحدود الان مرفوعه يعني، وهو هذا الهدف الاهم لداعش، انه لا حدود، دوله الخلافه تريد تستعمر العالم، وبالتالي هي أيضا تحقق الهدف. إما اتفاق روسيا وأمريكا أنه يدخلون في تحالف بالعراق، طبعا إرادة الحكومة العراقية، القرار السياسي العراقي اليوم هذا قرار استراتيجي. أيضا إحنا لا نلغي دور الحكومة العراقية، وين تجد المصلحة. الآن التحالف يقوم بدوره بالتعاون والتكامل مع الحكومة العراقية، وأيضا بتبادل معلومات وتبادل الدعم اللوجستي، وكذلك حتى تنسيق الضربات الجوية وتنسيق مع غرفة العمليات العراقية اليوم. فدخول روسيا وأمريكا بتحالف داخل العراق أو غيره هذا له محدداته، وله أيضا يقوم أو لا يقوم بإرادة عراقية. شكرا جزيلا.
I will take two last questions and then we have to end. The gentleman here. Yes. And then the gentleman on the back. Please be succinct.
My question for Mr. Qubat Talabani. Mr. David Pollack said that there is a willingness to reach a compromise in the Kurdistan region. Do you agree with him, or is there any mediation from your party or other parties?
Thank you very much. And just behind, yeah.
Thank you. Last year, some American mainstream media and think tanks described coalition against ISIS as a show, an unreal strategy aimed domestic politics in United States and Congress election. I have 4 clear questions, and I hope here clear answers. First, last year after Mosul, Daesh or ISIS was very close to capture Erbil, this city. Several calls from Erbil goes to coalition members and no answer. And Iran was the first and the last country that intervened and saved the city. Why the coalition and the countries in the coalition did not answer to these calls? The second, what was the situation if Erbil was in the hand of ISIS as Mosul right now, situation of the Middle East? Third, do you think ISIS is useful as a tool as jihadis in 1990s in Afghanistan? And fourth, one of the speakers said that ISIS is not popular in Arab world, especially in Saudis.
The latest poll issued in Western media says that 92% of Saudis support ISIS. Is there any new poll or any change? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would you like? Yeah, please start. Would you like?
The question was directed to me about the Kurdish political process, so I think I will switch to Kurdish as it's very relevant to the Kurdish audience, but also our international friends. بێگومان پرسیارێکم ئاڕاستە کرا سەبارەت بە دۆخی سیاسی لە هەرێمی کوردستان و ئایا ئامادەبوونێک هەیە لایەنە سیاسیەکانەوە بۆ ئەوەی بگەینە ڕێککەوتنێک و کوردستان دەربازکەین لە قەیرانە سیاسیەکەی کە تووشی بووە کە سەرەڕای ئەو هەموو قەیرانانەی تر کە ڕۆیان لە کوردستان کردووە. ئەبێ ئامادەبوونێک هەبێ بۆ ئەوەی ڕێککەوین. ئەمڕۆ ڕۆژێک نییە کە ئێمە خلافمان هەبێ لە نێو ماڵی خۆمان. ئەمڕۆ ئێمە لە کوردستان تووشی چەندین قەیران بووینە، قەیرانی کوشندە، قەیران کە بتوانێ بە تەواوەتی ئەو ئەزموونە سەرکەوتووی کوردستانمان تێک بدە. ئێمە دوای ئەم هەموو ساڵە نابێ بگەڕێینەوە چوارگۆشەی یەکەم و بیلەوە بکەینەوە ئەم ئەزموونەی کە هەمانە و کە تا ئێستا بە ڕەنج و ماندووبوون و خوێنی شەهیدەکانمان و ماندووبوونی کادرەکانمانەوە کوردستانمان گەیاندە ئاستێک کە جێی شانازی بوو بۆ خۆمان لە جیهان و بۆ ناوچەکەشە. بۆ یەکە ئەمڕۆ کوردستان ڕوبەڕوو کێشەیەکی سیاسی بووە و پێم وایە لایەنەکان هەمویان لە ڕێگای خۆیانەوە ئامادەبوونی خۆیانیان دەربڕێوە بۆ ئەوەی دەوری خۆیان ببینن بۆ ئەوەی کوردستان دەربازکەن لەم قەیرانە سیاسیە. ئەو حزبەی کە خۆم ئەندامم تیای بە ئاشکرا ڕایگەیاندووە کە ئێوێ دەوری نێوانگیری ببینێ لە بینی دوو تەرەف کە ئەمڕۆ کێشەیەکی سەختیان هەیە کە کێشەیەکی سیاسیان هەیە. کوردستانەکەمان بە هەمومانەوە جوانە، کوردستانەکەشمان بە هەمومانەوە گەشە ئەکا، کوردستانەکەشمان بە هەمومانەوە دەربازە بێ لە قەیرانەکانی کە ڕۆیان لە کوردستان کردووە و کوردستانەکەشمان بە هەمومانەوە ئەتوانین بەهێزتر بەرامبەر تێروریستانی داعش بوەستین. کوردستانەکەمان بە هەمومانەوە ئەتوانین قەیرانی دارایی چارەسەرکەین و اقتصادی کوردستان، ئابووری کوردستان بخەینە سەر ڕێچکەیەکی دروستەوە. ئەگەر پێویستمان بە هاوکاری لایەنی سێهەم بوو، لایەنی بیانی بوو، بێگومان داوا لە دۆستەکانمانەکەین و بێگومانیش باوەڕ ناکەم دۆستەکانمان هاوکارمان نەبن. بۆیە گفتوگۆ بەردەوامە. من هەمیشە خۆم کەسێکی گەشتبینم، گەشتبینیشم لەوەی کە ئەتوانین لە هەموو قەیرانەکان کە ڕویان لە کوردستان کردو دەرباز بین بە قەیرانی سیاسیشەوە. سوپاس.
Thank you very much. Would you like to respond to any of the questions, Mr.
Yeah,
David
thank
Pollock?
you. I want to address a couple of points that were asked by the gentleman in the center. First of all, about the defense of Erbil in August of 2014. The truth is, as you said, you're right, Iran contributed to the defense of Erbil against ISIS, but so too did the United States. The fact is that it was American airstrikes right away in August of 2014 that, along with Iranian-supplied weapons to the Peshmerga, that were able to defeat the ISIS attempt to capture this city of Erbil. So the United States was very much a part, right from the beginning, of the Kurdish efforts to defend themselves against ISIS, and we have continued to play that role, not just in August of last year, but all through the past 15 months, whether it was in Kirkuk or in Mahmur or in Sinjar, in Shingal, or any other place on the borders of the KRG. It is the continuing support with weapons now, and with airstrikes, and with advisors, and intelligence, and even special operations forces. It is continued US support that is helping the KRG to defend itself and to push ISIS back and ultimately to defeat it in Iraq. The problem that we have in Syria is, by contrast, that we do not have good local partners on the ground in much of Syria, although we are working now with the YPG and the PYD in the Kurdish areas of that country. But we are not willing to support the Assad regime in the fight against ISIS, I think for very good reasons. And we are not willing to support Jabhat al-Nusra or other jihadis in Syria in their fight against either the Assad regime or against Daesh. Again, I think for very good reasons. And so that brings me to my answer to your other question about whether somehow or other the United States thinks that ISIS serves a purpose, as you put it, as was true of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan 20 or 30 years ago. And the answer is no. The United States does not think that ISIS serves any purpose. That we learned a lesson from Al-Qaeda and from what happened to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan after they defeated the Soviet Union. We learned that you cannot support jihadis anywhere for any purpose and think that you will escape scot-free. And that is why today Jabhat al-Nusra is on our list of terrorist organizations, even though it is fighting against the Assad regime, which we also want to get rid of someday. And that is why the United States every day is hitting ISIS targets with airstrikes and fighting against them. So this idea that somehow the United States wants to keep ISIS because it serves some purpose is nonsense. And I hope that you will accept that from me, because I am not in the US government and I criticize US government policies in Syria or even here in Iraq in some respects. But this conspiracy theory deserves to be buried right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, would you like to add something to your previous answer?
I want to add something to what my friend David said. I was in Erbil that potentially fateful Thursday when ISIS was very close to coming into the city. And I also served, as some of you may know, in Washington for a good 12 years. So I have a little understanding of how the US government works and how it makes decisions. And yes, the colleague in the crowd was right. Iran was probably the first country to come to the support of Kurdistan in its war against ISIS, and the KRG has made that expression of gratitude explicitly clear on numerous occasions to our public, but also to the Islamic Republic of Iran. But I was personally on the phone that night with many of my friends in the US government, in the White House, the State Department, in other centers of power in Washington. And I have never seen the United States make a decision so quickly, so forcefully. That night they decided to strike ISIS. And had they have not struck ISIS that night, I think the next day we would have been in serious trouble. So I don't think any one of us can criticize the United States for acting slowly in responding to the threat of ISIS on Kurdistan specifically. So I do want to make that absolutely clear. I was personally astounded by how quickly they were able to turn it around. A friend of mine in the US government said, Qubad, we have a meeting with President Obama. I cannot tell you what the outcome of that meeting is going to be, but I guarantee you're going to like it. You know, this is a very different, it was a very different message from we will respond at a time and a place of our choosing, which was a very commonly used American statement that was always told to us throughout the years of when we were fighting Saddam. So they turned it around very quickly, and their decisive action to strike ISIS when they did was instrumental in turning the tide in the fight against ISIS.
Thank you very much. Any last response you would like to make? Unfortunately, we have to end now. I know that was a very interesting panel. Thank you very much. Many warm thanks to our panelists, and many thanks to the audience for their contribution.